Hello, my name is Luke Jennings. I'm VP of R&D at Push Security, and welcome to today's webinar on a Phish kit teardown. Okay, what are we going to cover today? So, as a quick agenda, as a background, we'll look at attacker in the middle toolkits, that's sort of 101 to set the scene. We'll cover the state of anti-phishing controls and what the general strategies tend to be. And then we're going to dive in deep and look at how modern phishing tools are evading detection. We're going to look at a whole range of techniques there, why the controls are failing, and we'll look at the sort of pyramid of pain and how that features in at the end. And then we'll consider briefly the future of anti-phishing controls. Okay, so attacker in the middle toolkits are the new normal now. Almost all kind of phishing toolkits we see come out there now tend to be attacker in the middle, so they're intended to bypass MFA. So 99% of MFA methods used, as we observe them, are not passkeys effectively. So passkeys are designed to provide protection against attacker in the middle techniques, but in practice, we don't see them widely adopted. And so these toolkits are designed to get around your common one-time password, push notification, SMS-based kind of methods. The other aspect is that the vast majority of phishing attacks we see target IDP credentials typically. So it could be like, Okta, Microsoft Entra, Google Workspace, and so they're impersonating legitimate login pages. Typically speaking, we see Microsoft by far as the most common one, but overall, it's like overwhelming majority is some form of IDP. And attackers are using both commercially available tools, open source tools as well, and private criminal tooling. There are, once you go into the criminal space, there are so many toolkits out there, but like just some examples for now. Jennings is an open source and commercial toolkit. And then things like Evil Proxy, Tycoon, Naked Pages, there are many more. They tend to be more criminal toolkits. But there are dual use ones as well, like Jennings, for example, we'll see used by red teamers, but we also see it used criminally sometimes too. But there are a lot of different toolsets out there implementing this technique. And we've seen the stats on the side there, like just Tycoon alone, for example, between October 2023 and Feb 24, there was like 1,100 domains detected just by one company associated with that. Microsoft has said they've seen 146% increase in attacker in the middle attacks. That was just in 2023, and they've only increased more in 2024. So it's the new normal. This is not a new threat anymore. This is how phishing threats that compromise identities work now. Okay, so how does an attacker in the middle attack work at the high level? What's the 101 here? Essentially, we have a malicious page accessed by a victim, sort of standard, phishing link they've clicked on. The traffic is routed via the attacker's proxy server, and they're proxying requests through to the legitimate page that they're impersonating. So let's say that's Microsoft Entra, for example. At this point, the victim enters their credentials. They'll then be prompted for any MFA, which they'll approve. And at that point, the credentials, including like the username and password, whatever the MFA token was at the time, and most importantly, the session cookies are intercepted by the attacker at that point. The requests are passed on to the genuine login pages, and the victim logs in and sees their normal account as they'd expect to see it. It's just being proxied via the attacker. But at this point, the attacker has the session cookies, and therefore they can perform a session hijacking attack and take over the user's account. So I'm just going to show you a real brief example using Jennings, just what this looks like from an attacker's point of view and from a victim's point of view, and then we'll move on. So at a very basic level, I've got a victim on the left here. I'm using an Jennings instance. On the right, I'm controlling that. So this is like on the right is the attacker's view. I've visited the URL, and I'm now entering my credentials. I'm seeing a Microsoft login page. I'm interacting with it normally. I'm entering my password, and I now log in to my account, and I will now be prompted for MFA. In this case, I've got Microsoft Authenticator set up with a one-time password. I've gone to my phone to fetch that, and I've entered that, and now I've accessed my account correctly. So you'll see now I log into Microsoft 365, and that's my legit account. Well, on the right, we've captured the password, and we've also captured the sessions, which is the important bit. So I could now go and display this session, and I would be able to import that into my own browser as an attacker to hijack that if I'd like to. So that's basically what it looks like at a very basic level from both the victim's perspective and the attacker's perspective. Okay, so the state of anti-phishing controls. What are they? How do they work? There's lots of different things we could factor in here. I've kind of divided it into these categories as key ones. So we've got, first of all, we've got the sort of threat intelligence approach, TI feeds. They tend to be sort of very much URL and IP and domain block lists. And even if you aren't subscribed specifically to a TI feed, even if you haven't gone and paid for a private TI feed to integrate into your solutions, for example, you're probably still making use of this to some extent because there's things like Google Safe Browsing and other stuff that get integrated into web browsers. The idea is to prevent access to known bad sites, though. It may be implemented in the browser if it's something via Chrome, for example, but typically people might integrate these into their web proxies or their EDR solutions, or just they might have logging going into a SIM and it's all kind of connected up there. The reality is probably the most phishing attacks are stopped at this level because it's all the sort of known bad stuff that's been found and burnt. So it's not like this doesn't have a place. But this is kind of like your first level, and it tends to be the sort of slightly more backwards looking stuff. That's not always the case, but as a general rule of thumb, that tends to be how it is. But you've also then got, say, web traffic analysis that may happen at the proxy level, secure web gateways, that kind of thing. And there we'll sort of see some sort of statically analyzed web pages at that point normally. So we're sort of, we've got solutions that are looking at the network traffic going back and forwards between a target user and a web page, looking at the requests and responses, maybe doing some SSL decryption to inspect that properly, and then potentially performing some kind of signature analysis on that, looking for other details beyond just domains and IPs. You'll also have website sandboxing. So that's almost like the dynamic analysis aspect. So this is a little bit like, in the malware world, we might detonate a malware sample in some kind of sandbox, but this kind of happens at the website level as well with some sort of automated solution crawling websites. So this could be, for example, email security gateways, analyzing links that are in external emails that come into users, and they may even directly visit those pages and analyze them, and there'll be some sort of dynamic analysis that's able to be occurred there because there'll be some sort of automation in terms of visiting those links, or it could be security vendors finding new links and proactively going and looking out for new malware servers that might be out there. The fourth thing is probably authentication controls. Now SSO and MFA, they weren't brought in 100% to deal with phishing only, but obviously it's a key aspect of them in that they help protect against traditional credential harvesting focused phishing, particularly MFA. So when we had traditional credential phishing that was based around just capturing a password, the introduction of MFA meant that that password could not be used on its own, and so therefore significantly reduced the opportunity for credentials to be stolen and used. And it's for that reason that we've seen the introduction of attacker in the middle phishing toolkits. They've been introduced to bypass MFA specifically. So these are the controls we tend to see in general. So the question is why are they failing? I've kind of alluded to certain aspects of this, but TI feeds, for example, the problem with those is that they just can't keep up with all the changes to attacker infrastructure and tooling. They're based on things that have already been identified as malicious and then added to lists. So they are a good control to have in place. It's like a first layer of defense, but there are so many toolkits out there, so many different domains hosting things. It's always generally a more backwards looking approach that's protecting you against whatever's been identified already. And then there's a window in which new phishing kits are not on these lists, and they will be successful for as long as they can until they eventually get uncovered and added to TI feeds, for example. So that's the aspect there. So it's not that TI feeds don't work at all. It's that they can kind of inevitably only deal with a certain percentage of kits, generally the things that aren't brand new. The other aspect is that controls aren't always in the right place to intercept these attacks now. So for example, the best example of this would be like email gateways. Obviously, in the past, email was the primary mechanism by which phishing attacks were delivered, like corporate email. But it's so much more common now for there to be many other delivery vectors available to target victims. It may be that they're also logged into their personal email accounts on the same laptop, for example. Maybe they're logged into their Gmail as well. They could be targeted that way. But really more modern aspects will be instant messenger based. It might be that they get targeted over their Slack or their Teams instance, or maybe even personal social media too. So like it could be, maybe you use Teams in your organization, but they're also on certain community Slack channels that may be related to their work as well. Or the most interesting one nowadays tends to be things like LinkedIn social media. So that is obviously, LinkedIn is normally very related to someone's job. They may be accessing it daily from their work system. And they could be targeted via there as well. And so the reality is corporate solutions like email gateways just don't have the ability to inspect links here. The same can apply with proxy servers, with sort of so much remote work and mobile workers and all the rest of it now, it can be quite difficult to route everything through centralized proxy servers. So often will be in the case where proxy servers are just not able to inspect all the traffic. So they might not always be there. So that's another aspect. And generally, just like with endpoint attacks, attackers, they're aware of the detection approaches that are being used in the industry, and they're just taking steps to get around them. It's your classic cat and mouse game, and we'll see a bit of that later when we look through some of the techniques being used. You can almost see the history of the battles that have been fought by seeing the development of these controls that are in place. Okay, so let's look at an example attack chain here that's kind of getting around these things. Maybe an attacker hosts a phishing toolkit, but they do it on a previously unseen domain with a cloned login page, so it's not on any TI feeds. Maybe they do send it directly via email, but the secure web gateway solution has intercepted it, loads it in a sandbox, but the phish kit is detecting it's in a sandbox and it's redirecting to a benign site that's marked safe. Therefore, it gets passed on to the user. The user clicks the link, then they have their credentials stolen. It then prompts for an MFA factor. They aren't using passkeys like most people aren't, so that gets phished as well. Maybe the attacker's also gone to another layer where they're spoofing the correct device, making sure they're redirecting via the correct country and browser config to make sure they get around any sort of conditional access policies or other controls that might be in place there around that. And at the end of the day, the attacker achieves account takeover on the target app, even though some of these common anti-phishing controls are in place. So that's kind of what it looks like at a high level. So the question becomes like, how do defenders detect phishing kits, and how are attackers evading them? So from a high level, if you're not looking at the TI feed bits, we're moving on from the TI feed here. We're saying, yeah, of course, at a certain point, individual instances of phishing kits on certain domains and IPs are going to be detected and they'll get added to block lists. But we're trying to say, like, how do you get ahead of that? So typically speaking, the most common approaches we see here is that defenders either try to create some types of signatures to detect the phishing toolkit itself, or, and here's the interesting one, because so many phishing toolkits emulate one of a small number of cloned login pages, the other approach you can take, which is slightly more generic, is to actually detect cloned login pages themselves. So you don't have to do it generically for any possible login page, but if you focus on things like Microsoft and Okta and Google, for example, what you can do is you can look for pages that look like a Microsoft login page, for example, but aren't hosted on Microsoft.com or any other legitimate Microsoft domain, and then say, hang on a minute, that looks highly suspicious. Why are we seeing a Microsoft login page on a domain that isn't owned by Microsoft? So typically speaking, it tends to be one of these two approaches. Obviously, attackers are aware of these strategies. They're taking steps to evade them. We're going to see that shortly. Typically speaking, they either evade the common detection techniques through a range of means. This will make more sense when I go through the individual techniques. That's designed to kind of generically bypass signature-based approaches, or they're evading cloned login page detection specifically. This tends to have kind of two sub-techniques as well. Either it's through DOM obfuscation techniques, so the sort of under the hood changes to stop people from detecting something that looks similar, or it can actually be through visual obfuscation, so actual visual changes to the page that can prevent even computer vision based sort of AI approaches to detecting stuff. So we're going to see both of those, and it's quite interesting to see the development of these things. So we'll start out on the more generic evasion controls first of all, and I'll just run through a few different examples to give you an idea of what we see in the criminal kits out there. The first one of the most important ones, is actual legitimate service abuse. And I'm saying legitimate service abuse to talk about the general technique, but realistically right now, this is like almost entirely Cloudflare. Like I have seen others used as well. Like I've seen phishing kits that are actually hosted on S3, for example. So the URL is actually a legit Amazon URL. But Cloudflare is the big one. And there are hosting aspects to that too. So like I've got a domain up there that's a workers.dev domain. That's effectively almost like AWS Lambdas, but Cloudflare's example, if you're not familiar. So it's hosted on a legitimate domain. It's another example of that. So I have seen certain kits doing that, naked pages in particular. But the big one here is the use of Cloudflare Turnstile for bot detection. So rather than come up with all their own advanced bot detection techniques to avoid analysis, attackers are just taking a known solution out there and turning it against us, basically. Cloudflare Turnstile was put in place to prevent spam and general abuse by, getting rid of bots from your web apps. And attackers have said, we'd love the same thing for our phishing servers. And so they use Cloudflare Turnstile. And this prevents a lot of attacks, a lot of detection strategies, because it's hard for automated dynamic solutions to go out there and find new phishing servers and analyze them, because you've got this thing in place. And so therefore, it only operates as a phishing server when a real user is accessing it through a real browser. This alone is a really effective technique by attackers that's caused a lot of problems for defenders. So pretty much now, if you see a phishing server, it's almost certainly protected by Cloudflare Turnstile. Okay, so another one is having checks in place before serving malicious content. Now, Cloudflare Turnstile is one aspect of that, but there are more. So what we typically see is that often it's not a single URL that will be responsible for loading a phish kit. Often there'll be an initial URL that will be the phishing link that's sent to the user in some way. And that often then redirects onto other URLs and eventually lands at a final URL. And there's good reasons for doing this from an attacker's point of view. And one of them is that they can kind of push some of the more risky activity from their perspective that's more likely to be detected to the end of that chain and try and mask the approach of how they got there. And therefore, that means if defenders come across different URLs in that phase and try to visit them directly, they may not work correctly if they've not been reached in the correct order and with the correct parameters being supplied and that sort of thing. Now, I've got an example, just one example here. This applies in lots of different ways, but here is one that was for a naked pages example, and it required a particular authentication header to be set in the request, and that would only happen if this bit of JavaScript would execute on the page earlier, which you had to get past Cloudflare Turnstile to get to, and so forth. And therefore, only if you went through that process correctly as a user would you reach the correct domain and in the right way for it to trigger the malicious behavior. So this is a really good way. It's almost like an anti-sandbox approach for preventing analysis coming through in different ways. It kind of forces you to go through the full procedure as a user rather than being able to analyze new URLs or other things that have been found in other ways. Once you've got things in place that can put those checks in, you have to decide what you do afterwards. And a common technique we see here is just if it thinks that something's sus, maybe it's a bot that's accessing the page, maybe things have happened in the wrong order, it'll just default by redirecting to a legitimate domain, which it will then assume obviously won't be flagged as malicious. This can literally be example.com. So I've got an example where I have seen that happen. But there are other more sophisticated examples. In some cases, for example, I've seen kits that were clearly B2B targeted, because if it would actually even get as far as the Microsoft login page, or rather the fake Microsoft login page, and if you entered a personal account for Microsoft, it would then redirect to the legit live.com. And essentially, I guess the attackers weren't interested in personal accounts. But if you entered in a business account, it would then continue with the Phish. I've also seen more advanced examples recently. There was a kit recently that was using sort of like car sales websites as its benign redirect. So if it decided it didn't want to phish someone, it would come up with like a legit looking car website. And if it did want to target them, it would come up with the Microsoft login page. So that's a more sophisticated example. But typically speaking, sort of benign content or redirecting to legitimate domains is a common technique for getting around analysis, which leads on to another aspect we've seen, which is HTTP referrer header masking. So when I said before about how you have these different approaches where you can have a series of domains that get redirected through before you get to the actual phishing site. Now, if you imagine that maybe the end domain, like the third or fourth domain in the list is the final one, and maybe at a certain point that gets detected as malicious, obviously from a defender's point of view, you want to track that back and find where it came from in the first place. And you may, in many cases, in common solutions like proxy servers, you might have a log of the referrer that at least takes you back one step. And if you've got that, you then might be able to get a referrer of the one before. You may be able to follow it back. So from an attacker's point of view, it's good to mask that where possible. So we've often seen the use of, say, the href.ly service to perform redirects and to mask the referrer in the process to sort of break that link and make it harder to track things back to the original phishing URL. So we do see that as a technique too. And that leads on to load balanced domains, because some phishing kits out there, not only will they follow a redirect of multiple domains, but at a certain point they may fan out to one of many. It could be 10, could be 20, could be 30 different domains that they may randomly resolve to. Now, when I say load balanced, I assume this is not the attackers having such huge amounts of traffic that they can't handle it on a server. I think it's load balanced from a perspective of security. So the idea is that they try to maintain secrecy of the early URLs in the chain as best possible to make those last as long as possible. And they know that the latter domains are more likely to get detected because they're the ones that start to trigger the actual phishing. And so if let's say one of those domains gets flagged and then added to a TI block list, by having load balanced domains, other users that are targeted with the original URLs will randomly get one of many domains. So it may be that if there was 10 domains, one of them gets blocked, it's still got a 90% chance of success. And even if it hits the blocked one, they have the ability to either re-request if they see it's failed and get to one of the other domains that's still working, or they can just bug out at that point. But once an attacker has noticed that one URL is down, they can then remove it from the server that's given this list of URLs, and they can spin up new ones and add to them as well. So it's just a really good way for attackers to provide some resistance to detection and response and resistance to things getting added to TI feeds, and be able to update things accordingly over time. So that's quite an effective technique. We see that commonly used as well. Okay, so that's some sort of generic examples, different things that we see. There's all sorts of obfuscated code and other stuff as well, like you might expect to see. But now let's kind of focus in on one particular area. Because as I said before, cloned login page detections are a key strategy for defenders now too. And there is a battleground happening just in this specific area with phish kits as well. So I said before, we have sort of DOM obfuscation techniques and we have visual obfuscation techniques. So I'm going to start on the DOM side and we'll go into the visual ones after. So on the DOM side, what I'm talking about here is that you might have things that visually are identical or nearly identical, but the user can see those things as being identical, but maybe, under the hood, the sort of DOM might be different. So from a defender's point of view, doing image recognition traditionally has been harder than, doing text pattern matching on things, for example. So if someone was just like cloning the Microsoft login page in a very simple way, what you would expect to see is like a DOM structure that looks either completely identical or almost identical to the real one. So you could look for that. Now, in many of the cases with the criminal kits out there, they are radically different because effectively this technique's already been used and they've had to find ways around it. So just as an example of this, I've run some code on the right there, you can see, to just count up all the different tags in the DOM, which ones are in use and and how many of them there are. The top is legit Microsoft and the bottom is a phishing kit example, and you can see how they're not remotely similar. It's completely and utterly different. So under the hood, if you're trying to match on things that look like Microsoft HTML code in the DOM, you're not going to be able to do it. So this is a very common thing we see, is complete sort of obfuscation of the DOM structure entirely, but visually identical. So that's the approach they're taking. So another aspect is just simple things like the title. And you can probably see there's a favicon change thing there too. We'll come back to that. But look at the title here, sign into Outlook. There are a couple of different Microsoft login pages with slightly different titles, but that's one of them. That's a very, very specific piece of text that's set in the HTML in only one place. It's something very specific you could look for. How many websites have a title that says sign into Outlook? There's not really a particularly good reason to have that as your page title. So what we've seen here is that kits just actually randomize it. This is not something users really notice very often. I think if you think yourself, how often do you notice the page title when you're looking at a page? It exists, but it's when you look at it when you want to switch between tabs. But you might not notice it the rest of the time. And so I think to avoid easy static checks on this, a lot of kits have just randomized it. Sometimes we'll see like purely complete random alphanumeric text. Other times it will be like real sentences effectively. But there'll be many that will be randomly selected. So I've got some examples there of enter account for security, access profile safely, proceed to sign in. Nothing sounds too bad, but it's different to what the real Microsoft one is. So we see randomization occur there. Another interesting technique is desktop control solutions, which effectively completely and utterly change the DOM. So I mentioned most of the kits I've mentioned so far are sort of proxy-based attacker in the middle toolkits. There's a subset of those techniques though called browser in the middle. They tend to be less used in practice, but there are toolkits out there that do this. In fact, there's an open source toolkit called EvilNoVNC that does this. But they use desktop sharing techniques to remotely control a browser instead of a web proxy-based technique. So in this case, what you have is something that's visually identical, but the website's completely and utterly different under the hood. If you look at how these solutions work, they just have like one big HTML canvas element that's just drawn to. So, this is a little bit like the DOM kind of obfuscation technique we looked at the beginning, but specifically for desktop control solutions. You get something that looks completely different. So all you could really look for there is something that looks like a desktop control solution rather than something that looks like Microsoft HTML, for example. And one final thing, this is very similar to what happens in the malware world. So if you've done malware analysis, this will seem obvious, but just dynamic text decoding. It's really common as an obfuscation technique to see things that people might want to look for be encoded or encrypted in some way and then dynamically decrypted or decoded at runtime to make it more difficult to look for those signatures at the times and places that the detections are run. So if we look at the login page for Microsoft, for example, before, we're saying like, are there other specific bits of text we could look for, like in the title that we saw previously? Well, maybe like there's that email, phone, or Skype bit. I mean, it's not that specific, but the Skype part is quite Microsoft specific. I probably wouldn't expect to see that text very often, particularly not on a clear login page. And if you look like in this example, we've seen that wasn't in the original HTML code. It's actually decoded at runtime along with some other interesting bits, along with like a another Russian domain to access, and the password component. It's decoded from base 64, and this just makes it harder to create a signature using point-in-time static analysis techniques. So if your proxy server is looking at what goes back and forward on the wire, they're not going to see that specific string in the HTML because it's going to get loaded from some other place and then decoded from base 64. And so it's just a general obfuscation technique. Okay, image element obfuscation. So this is where we're starting to get into slightly hybrid approaches. But let's say we wanted to do some actual visual analysis, but rather than look at the whole page, we want to identify logos, for example. Maybe we want to look for the Microsoft logo existing on the page. Maybe we want to enumerate all the image tags and see if there's an exact replica of a Microsoft logo somewhere on a login page. Maybe that's suspicious. So the real one at the top there, you can see that's how it works. So in many cases, what we see is some sort of element of obfuscation around this to prevent people easily isolating images. So in this case, instead of having an image tag, they've actually put a div in place of a different size, and then they're making use of background image styling and so forth to produce an image at the end of the day that is visually identical on the page. But again, it's just another case of the underlying DOM structure that leads to that being very different. So this is an image focused obfuscation technique, but it happens at the content level, at the DOM level. So that's why I still put it into there, but it starts leading us nicely onto the more visual based approaches. So if we now move on to the visual obfuscation approaches where, okay, maybe defenders have said, oh, it's really hard to look for things under the hood because everything's obfuscated and changed. But at the end of the day, the login page visually looks the same to a user. So maybe we should try some computer vision techniques, for example. And at the very most basic level you could try this would be to look at the favicon. It's rendered at a fixed size, gives a fixed target, it's an easy place to look. It's much harder to sort of obfuscate that. And then you could look for, say, the Microsoft logo as the favicon, and you would hope that that's not commonly seen on lots of other websites. What we've seen here in many cases is that people just don't use a favicon. Again, I think just like the title randomization, I don't think users are really looking at this much. I don't think many users are looking at the tab and going, oh, there's no Microsoft logo, this must be phishing. I don't think it's part of the decision criteria for most people as to whether they fall for it or not. And therefore, I think most attackers have just said, there's no point, just don't have a favicon. It's only going to get us caught more easily. It doesn't really provide much value from their perspective. And so often we just see one is not used. Now, here's a really interesting one. The next two are really interesting because this shifts it from being a computer vision based problem to almost a human brain tricking problem. Imagine you're doing a more wider kind of image recognition process on a whole page. Now, if you look at those two images, they're actually very different. One's got a blurred background image. So if you forget about the modal in the middle, the biggest change is that one has a completely different background. If you were looking at sort of coarsely at percentage match of a page, you would find that those two images actually have quite a low percentage match. But from a user's perspective, it looks authentic, right? So that blurred background image, that's a common technique used by lots of apps with modals to have a blurred background. That's a legit image from a Microsoft website. It appears authentic. It's easy to just not spot that at first. But the idea is that the end result is the page visually is very different, but it still looks authentic to a user. So it's quite a clever technique doing that. The real page just has a plain background, but you can add authentic looking background images as a blurred image, and then you have something that overall is substantially visually different when an algorithm's looking at it. You may have noticed another change in that page, the logo as well. So we see the same thing with logo substitution. So maybe they've decided that, okay, although we saw that DOM modification before to make it harder to isolate logos, but maybe defenders have moved ahead and figured out a way to do it. Well, you could use different logos so you can't match on that. Or even for computer analysis techniques that are just looking for small template matching of a logo in a page. In this case, they've swapped the Microsoft logo for a Microsoft 365 logo. So again, this is a human brain tricking thing. If a user's familiar with that logo, it has authenticity because it is a real Microsoft logo, but it's not the Microsoft logo, and it is different. But a computer image recognition algorithm is going to look at those two logos and say they're completely different. So again, clever visual obfuscation technique that's used there. And finally, one thing we see is this is again a further technique for trying to prevent the isolation of sub-images. Sometimes we'll see the actual image that's used for a logo, for example, is obfuscated in some way if you get to the raw form. So I'm giving an example here of how this was computed in a div, but then the way the div is calculated means that not only does the image show in a visually identical way to the real one, but it's cut out in some way from the underlying image data so that only parts of that image show, which means even if you are able to calculate the real image within a div, for example, and then look at it, you'll find that that isn't actually the visible image. So it's like a sub-image obfuscation. You can see an example there where you've got this other sort of text surrounding it so that it's not quite the same. So effectively, it's just another way of obfuscating what image is available. So you can see there's many different techniques being used here, both at the content and the visual level. So okay, I've been through quite a lot of techniques now, so I want to kind of wrap up with the key points, say why detections are failing. And I want to sort of reference the pyramid of pain here. So I'd say typically detections focus on elements that are relatively easy for attackers to change. So, you know, obviously domains and IPs and TI feeds are the ones that are most backwards looking and are constantly evaded by attackers. But what we've seen before today now is that effectively things get better when we move towards the tool focused detections, and even better still when we focus to behaviors. Like that's the goal. But what we're seeing is that there's a cat and mouse game going here where actually, you know, there's a lot of circumventions going around, certainly at the tool level, and even at the behavior level for like the behavior of emulating a login page. So really, we need multiple things to be in place to try and have the most high-level generic detections in order to stand the best chance of dealing with the most advanced and current phishing threats. You know, so we just need to move up that pyramid of pain as best as possible. So really, we need better telemetry. We need to be able to observe all the different data and behaviors that enable us to do this. So you can see that clearly in some of the techniques we've seen before, they're clearly designed to get around things like proxy solutions and other things that look at static analysis at points in time, or, you know, the bot detection aspects will stop different automated solutions from looking at things. We really need to be able to see the phishing page as the user victim sees it to counter these techniques. So we can't rely completely on, you know, automated analysis of URLs or proxies, basically, because they just aren't in the place to see everything that's going on. And ideally, we need real-time enforcement too. So it could be that the page only renders properly and becomes a phishing site within the user's browser. And ideally, we need to be able to intercept attacks and deal with them as and when that occurs. So that's the kind of things we want to deal with, really. It's better telemetry, it's being in the right place, like victim observability, to be able to observe exactly what's happened to the actual victims as they are phished, and then the ability to real-time enforce controls when we are sure about something being a phishing server to stop the attack where possible, and for less sure cases, you know, firing off a detection and allowing our threat hunting teams to deal with that. So I'm going to just look very briefly at sort of how our approach aligns with this. So let's say in this case we've got an attacker hosting a phishing toolkit on a domain that's not on any TI feed, and then they deliver a link to a user but not via email, so it bypasses secure web gateways. Maybe it comes through some sort of social messaging platform. User opens a link, begins to enter their creds. What we would do is effectively, we've got a few different things on this pyramid. You know, we are looking for known toolkits that we have detections for. We are looking for cloned apps. But as you've seen today, it's impossible to stay 100% on top of these things. So the most generic control we have at the end is that we will observe and prevent the use of someone's actual password from being entered into the website. So if we see someone try to enter their Microsoft password, for example, into a website that isn't Microsoft, that's the very most generic behavior of phishing, is someone entering a password into the wrong website. We can detect to prevent that. So I'll just kind of show a couple of examples here. I'll show the tool detection side, then I'll show what happens with some, say like a new tool that there's no existing detection for, and how the SSO password protection can kick in here. So in a case of like something that's older and is known and triggers an existing detection, I want to show how something's delivered, say, by Slack in this example, and our browser extension is in place, so we don't need to be able to observe things through an email gateway or anything. It could come through a Slack instance or a LinkedIn post or whatever. We click the link, and you'll probably see, if your eyes are quick, that the page started to render, and when it hit a certain point, that it detected it as a known phishing toolkit, in this case, Evil No VNC. Our browser extensions kicked in and just prevented the user from even interacting with it at that point. Okay, so that's how a phishing toolkit detection works. But what I want to look at now is what happens when you've got an example that isn't detected by a current toolkit detection. And I'm going to use a criminal malware example here. So I'm going to visit this page. I just took one that was very new, and here you can see the Cloudflare aspect as well. So you'll see some of the aspects we saw earlier live. Now you're going to see the logo substitution and the background blurred images, all these other things. So at this point, we haven't triggered any detections, and I'm going to pretend I'm going to start entering my credentials. Okay. At this point, this is where our SSO password protection could kick in. I'm starting to type my IDP password. As soon as I type the last character, the extension kicks in, prevents anything else from being sent, and prevents the user from interacting with the page any further, and then we'll send an alert back to your SIM as well. So that's your catch-all to deal with brand new, unknown phishing threats. You kind of 0 days of attacker in the middles, effectively. Okay, so in conclusion, we've seen here just how many different phishing approaches are being used, or rather detection evasion approaches are being used by phishing toolkits to get around the common controls we see there. We've seen how, obviously TI feeds can only ever deal with a certain portion. They are inevitably, backwards looking to some extent. But at this point in time, even the more sort of tool-orientated detections are having limited shelf lives. And realistically, if you really want to be at the high level of dealing with this, you need some very high-level generic controls, and you need to be in the right place to observe some of this going on. So you've seen how a lot of the strategies now are designed to really circumvent traditional web proxies and email security gateways and that kind of thing. Really, right now, if you want to be on the bleeding edge of this and dealing with these threats, you need to be in the browser. The browser is effectively the one place you can observe and intercept attacker in the middle phishing attacks, because you observe exactly how they interact with the user when they are behaving as they should, rather than the evasion techniques they might use in a sandbox kind of approach. So that's the kind of conclusion. And at this point, I guess we can move on and say, are there any questions?
We've had lots of questions come in. So as we start going through them, if there are any more questions, please feel free to fire them into the chat, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. But the first one here arrived quite early in the session. Is there any research evidence of the adversary in the middle toolkit capable of compromising passkeys?
Okay, so passkeys implemented correctly are designed to be unphishable, as in they're designed to pin the authentication method to the particular domain. So they are what's known as phishing resistant MFA. There are some gaps we see related to that. I mean, the main issue at the moment is take-up is very low. And it tends to be only at the sort of IDP level. And when you go outside of that, support is very low anyway. And so there's a coverage issue. But in terms of if you do have passkeys implemented, there's probably two aspects that we see that can be gaps around that. One of them is what's known as like an MFA downgrade attack. So it's kind of similar to the old days of like SSL downgrade attacks and that kind of thing. But in many cases, organizations will have passkeys or like commercial equivalents like FastPass for Okta set up so that it might be the default authentication method, but it's not the only server-side supported authentication method. Partly because there's a bit of a management pain with them, and if they, if it's a physical device, if people like break it or they lose a device or whatever, and so you might be able to say, click, verify with something else, or log in another way. So there's often a way to sort of go around it if a user wants to, but by default, they would just log in with their passkey. And the thing is, if you have any setup that allows any other mechanism like that, then it's possible for an attacker in the middle kit that's slightly more advanced to force that authentication method. And there are kits out there that do this. So some kits that I've seen with this, I haven't tested it exhaustively, but some kits I've seen with this in the past will break, as in they haven't been designed to get around passkeys, probably because they haven't bothered yet because it's so rare. But some of them will actually just force a one-time password route. And if the server still accepts that, then it will still work. That does give you other options for detection though, because you could then, if you know that almost always your authentication method is passkeys, you could try and put back-end detections for one-time passwords and investigate them. That's one aspect. There was a talk at Black Hat about that with Windows Hello for Business, particularly as well. Now, the other aspect, I'm kind of going into another topic here, so I'll probably just point you at a blog post I put out recently. There's something called cross-IDP impersonation, where you can authenticate to certain downstream apps with a different IDP, and you can configure those by setting up an account with a different IDP, and then you only need to phish a one-time password once in order to do that, and then that completely bypasses all SSO situations. That's quite a complicated topic I can't describe in one question though. So if you're interested in that, I'd just say look up my recent blog post on cross-IDP impersonation, because that's effectively a way to bypass passkeys as well. And I give that demo, a video demo of getting around passkeys using that.
Okay, next question. Well, I can answer this one. The feature that you register, you putting your password in the browser at the end, what do you call that? That is called SSO password protection. And you can find that on the website. I'll go and find another link to the feature release for that and stick it in the chat. Yeah, great. Is the push solution useful when efficient conditional access controls are in place?
Okay. It depends on the specific conditional access policies you're talking about. There's lots of ways you can configure it. You would just have to test any individual solution with this. Say, like the most common ones I see are sort of IP based, sometimes device based. But yeah, that's probably what I can say on that.
Yeah, I think there's probably the other angle, which is, the session hijacking on downstream apps and things like that. Like typically when you're taking over an IDP account, you're not stopping there. You're using that to then authenticate to various other apps. So yeah, if your access control policies typically only apply at the sort of IDP level, not usually for downstream SaaS, things like that. So yeah, it's not necessarily phishing attacks, but if somebody managed to, for example, phish your session cookies or steal your session cookies in a variety of ways, perhaps do info stealer compromises, things like that, then you'll be able to, your access control policies won't necessarily stop you from that sort of attack path. Cool. Just one other question, I think. Are attackers learning from existing detections, or are they predicting and guessing what defenders will try to create signatures for, do you think?
It's a good question. I don't think I really know the answer. I would take a guess that it's reactive. They produce something and then they analyze when things stop working and try and figure out why, and then they do things in response. And I feel like some of the things I've talked today is almost me reverse engineering that process of seeing what what people have implemented in kits now, and then it's normally relatively obvious why they've done it. People don't do things unless it's, you know, for a reason. So I think, you know, and all the things I spoke about, like obviously signatures of some kind have been around for a long time. So all the kind of general obfuscation techniques are kind of expected there. But I know at least like cloned login page detection type things have become more normal, and there are both DOM elements to that and visual elements to that, even inside things of like Chrome itself. So I know that those things are happening on the defense side, and so it seems quite clear why the changes have been there. So I suspect it's mostly reactive. There might be some more advanced attackers that are doing some proactive things, but I would expect the mass targeted stuff is going to be reactive, because also, even if you develop that ahead of time, you don't want to give away your new stealth characteristic until you need to, right? Unless it's a really high value target. I think for the more mass appeal stuff, you hold that back, you wait until someone detects your new thing, and then you put in the next thing that you've already produced. But, you know, that's why I'm doing a little kind of expectation management there. I haven't spoken to most of the criminals, sadly.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Well, I think that's probably everything we've got time for today. So thank you very much for everyone for attending. Thanks for Luke for the excellent talk. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us via the website or via social media. You'll all receive a copy of the recording. And yeah, thanks very much for joining, and we hope to see you again next time.